The first of our afternoon panel discussions is entitled U.S. Militarism and Its Constant Drumbeat for War. And my name is Carolyn Pavel, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you today our three speakers, beginning with David Goldberg, Professor Emeritus of History at Cleveland State University. His published work and lectures treat the subjects of labor, immigration, and urban history. His presentation today is entitled Why Debs Was Right to Oppose U.S. Entry into the Great War. And he also has some other information about his background that he will probably share during his presentation.
First of all, I'm not going to use a mic. I used to be a vendor at ballparks, so I got a loud voice. And one thing you know about Eugene v. Debs and Norman Thomas, who was referred to this morning, all those people used to speak without any kind of mic. They all had loud voices. And you look at that photo of Debs addressing a crowd in Canton on June 16th, 1918, his veins are like bulging. And he always spoke with a great deal of emotion. And I was trying to figure out, reading the wonderful book Ernest Freeburg wrote and other works on Debs, I would try to figure out what he did when he wasn't campaigning for president. And the only thing I could figure out, he was always speaking, all the time, as well as writing. Debs, I imagine, spoke to some very small crowds and some very large crowds. But that's what he always did. He went out and spoke. So my talk today, which I'll make brief, has a very simple premise. And that is, Eugene v. Debs was absolutely right to oppose the war that was known as the Great War at the time. Now, this is a conflict that cost 10 million lives. That's 10 million. And it's obvious when you look at this conflict, in its origins, it was nothing but a crass struggle for power between rival capitalist and imperialist countries at its origins. This is very easy, actually, to demonstrate. For example, you can consider the fact that the nations referred to as democracies, Great Britain and France, were allied with Tsarist Russia, one of the worst autocracies in the world. But more important from our perspective is Great Britain and France, who the U.S. will ally with, during the war, during the previous 70 years, had brought most of Asia and Africa under their imperial control. This being Great Britain and France. I might add, this also is the context for French imperial control in Indochina, that the Vietnamese state from 1858 was included as part of the French colonial empire at this time. Also consider the fact the way that Great Britain entered the war in 1914. This was because Germany, I won't go into the background of all this, invaded France through Belgium. The Western press was filled with comments about poor little Belgium that Germany had invaded France through. But where was the outrage when the King of Belgium, Leopold, brought the Congo under Belgian control, killing millions in the search for gold and diamonds? But we heard this phrase, poor little Belgium. Consider the way the Ottoman Empire entered the war. Not immediately, but after it began, in order to gain territory from its traditional rival, Tsarist Russia. The Ottoman Empire entered the war, led to the mass genocide killing of Armenians. Also consider the fact that British and German troops left their trenches on Christmas Eve 1914 to fraternize with one another in Flanders, where you can visit mass graves today. News of this Christmas truce was repressed, and commanders made sure it never occurred again. Consider how Italy entered the war. In 1915, Italy went to the Central Powers and to Great Britain and France and said, who can give me a better deal? And negotiated. The British and French offered more territory and secret treaties, so Italy entered the war on the side of the British and French. The massive Italian defeats in the Dolomites especially is what led to the rise of Mussolini by 1922, one of many dictatorships to emerge from this war. Consider the Sykes-Picot Treaty, a secret treaty signed by the British and French in which they agreed on how they would carve up the Ottoman Empire at the end of the war. Consider the fact that Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan resigned in 1915 because he said, quite correctly, that Woodrow Wilson's so-called policy asserting the traditional rights of neutrals tilted towards the British by permitting American banks to make loans to the British. Bryan predicted that this would mean that the U.S. would become dependent on a British victory. And this is what occurred. Consider the fact that Woodrow Wilson brought the United States into the war, claiming that he could change a crass struggle for power to make the world safe for democracy. That was Wilson's claim. He fought a war to make the world safe for democracy, while the federal government crushed the industrial workers of the world, beginning with simultaneous raids on all of their offices in September 1917. In 1918, though, and we heard some reference to this yesterday, many people accepted Wilson's claim that this now was a war to make the world safe for democracy. And I think, Debs favored revising the St. Louis Pledge that we saw this morning, because he, I think, had seen this tidal wave of support for Wilson in 1918. And he must have been disturbed about it. But what happened at Versailles proved the correctness of everything Eugene V. Debs stood for in regard to his position against the war. Wilson talked about self-determination endlessly, but it turned out self-determination did not apply to Asia and Africa, where the British and French actually extended their control. Even Ireland remained under the British yoke. In the Middle East, Iraq was created as a new nation under British control, and in fact, there was a rebellion in Iraq in 1920 against British authority. More than that, territory was taken from Germany, and the new government of Germany, which had absolutely nothing to do with the war, since the Kaiser had abdicated, this was a new government of Germany, was saddled with reparations. I could go on and on about Wilson's dismal performance at Versailles, but I won't because of time. But I would refer you to one book. That is the book by the brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, where he predicted Versailles would lead to a world depression as it did, and of course to an even greater conflagration. The Second World War was merely a continuation of the first. Fascism and Bolshevism both emerged from this conflict. I was very glad to hear the second speaker this morning point out the fact that Debs always had a moral quality to him. He initially greeted the Bolshevik Revolution, but he turned it against it by the early 1920s because he recognized it was a violation of his own democratic principles. Again, you could go on, but there's only one conclusion I think one can reach when looking at these events. It's Eugene Debs and not Woodrow Wilson who should be honored. Thank you.